Hello everyone and welcome back to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be talking about DarkHawk Dino. So this is a very familiar deck for me. I used to play a ton of it, and now we have a really core structure revolving around DarkHawk and Devil Dinosaur that you can easily play around. So what is DarkHawk Dino? That's my bad. What is this sucker? So this deck is generally a strong deck where you're trying to rely on DarkHawk or Devil Sword to really be your main win conditions, and you have cards that just synergize with those two cards like Moon Girl, like Korg, RockSlide, and you just have that Mystique as a backup plan to double the point values and just create another point of pressure in the deck. So here we have a standard list, just a classic DarkHawk Dino list. There's not really anything too fancy here. You've got the Shang-Chi, you've got the Cosmo as your defensive units, and you have just the Sentinel, the Moon Girl, the Zabu, and the Quinja just for the early game aggression. So you can definitely tweak this if you want, but I would say this is a pretty easy classic deck. A lot of people have one or two deck techs that they want to play depending on the meta, but overall this will get you pretty far. So first off, we want to talk about DarkHawk. This is one of your main win conditions. It just presents a large point threat. If you don't have any synergy, this is really only a 6-point card. But if you have just a couple synergies, right, any locations or something like a RockSlide, this can easily be a 4 energy 10 cost card or 4 energy 12 cost card. I've definitely seen this card go up to 20 power, 30 power with some locations, but yeah, definitely a big threat if you have synergy for it. Next up, we have Devil Dinosaur. This is the alternative win condition that you can just generate large point values with. This is definitely more in your control. You have to have a big hand, so anytime you see that's happening, some locations do give you card draw, making this a lot easier to do, but this can be a very, very strong card, very consistent if you play around it. Next up, we have Mystique. This is also another core piece, in my opinion, just because it synergizes very well with the DarkHawk and the Dino. So if you are running those two cards, Mystique just copies that point value and gives you another point of pressure to play into. So definitely a solid card, very flexible, works with a lot of what you want to do. So really something you want to be thinking about when you're playing this deck. Next up, we have Zabu. This sets up your 4 cost cards, making them a little bit cheaper, allowing you to play them on turn 3, also allowing you to do double 4 on the final turn, or 3 and a 4, whatever combination that makes the most sense to you. So just a very core card. This is something that if you're wanting to play DarkHawk, you pretty much need a Zabu to have it feel fun, feel flexible, where you feel like you have enough time and energy to react to things. So this is definitely a pretty important card, something you always want to be thinking about when you're playing this type of deck. Next up, we have RockSlide. So this buffs up your DarkHawks and makes your opponent draw worse. It's kind of hard to play DarkHawk without running a RockSlide. They kind of go hand in hand, and they're really core for that type of composition. So anytime you want to be playing DarkHawks, this is definitely something very solid to add into your composition. And last but not least, we do have Korg. This is just a cheaper way to buff up the DarkHawk and ruin your opponent's draws. It's just a very synergistic card with the DarkHawk that you can play early. Sometimes you're not knowing what to do. This card also works very well when you are playing it in the later stages of the game to kind of be a filler for the flexibility. Maybe turn 4, you want to play the DarkHawk plus the Korg to have that synergy automatically. So just a very nice flexible piece that's cheap, but also buffs up your DarkHawks and makes the things very synergy. You can put Moon Girl and Coulson, all that stuff. They're not really what I would call core, because there's so many different pieces that can be replaced in the draw engine for a Dino deck list. So here we have the early game setup. So these cards buff your finishers. They allow you to allow your early game to go smoothly. So if you start off with some of these early game cards, you're going to have a pretty nice time. So as long as you have the setup, it's a lot easier to just have the final turns play out the way you want them to be. If you don't get a Zabu, if you don't get the Quinjet, stuff like that, it's going to be a lot harder to have a clean turn. You're kind of just hoping that your big card is good enough, and it's not as flexible normally if you have the Zabu down, if you have the Quinjet down. Next up, we have your win condition finisher. So these are just the cards that you're focused on. You need to be drawing at least one, hopefully two of these, to have a good end game where you're going to be able to play your composition and finalize with your finishers to win those 2 lanes, right? Usually one of these finishers will win a lane for you. So when you have 2, you can win those 2 lanes. So those are the DarkHawk, the Devil Dinosaur, and then the Mystique. So you're really needing these cards. If you draw the synergies, but you don't draw the win conditions, well, it's going to be really hard for you to win those games. So you definitely want to keep that in mind when you are piloting this deck. Now, speaking of how to pilot, you definitely want to set up for the later turns. The early turns are important, but they don't matter as much as making sure that your later turns you have the threats in the lanes that they need to be. So playing down the Quinja and the Zabu, it can be important for having flexibility in those final turns. You want to be able to play at least 2 cards in those final turns, and if they cost 4, well, you're not going to be able to play multiple cards, right? Maybe you want to do something like Mystique into Shang-Chi. Well, if you don't have the Zabu down, the Shang-Chi is going to be too expensive for you to play, so you want to make sure that you have this setup down so that you can really pop off in those final turns. You want to avoid playing Quinja Zabu in locations that can backfire. So Zabu, right, and Quinja, those are cards if you give to your opponent can really swing the state of the game. So you do want to be careful not playing them into an unknown location and maybe you lose the ongoing ability, or maybe they get sent to the opponent's side, or maybe they get destroyed on turn 3 or turn 4. So it's just something to be safe. Normally I do recommend playing on unknown locations, but with Quinja Zabu, if they do backfire those locations, that can be an insta loss. So you do want to be careful about that. You can definitely risk if you want to, but you just have to be aware that, oh, I'm taking a risk when I'm playing these into a location I'm not sure will stick around for the future. Having control of the number of cards in your hand can be super important. This is definitely a Devil Dinosaur composition where you want to be making sure that, okay, I have a lot of cards in my hand, but I still want to draw. There are ways where you can, especially if you're playing a lot of Sentinels, where you can overdraw and not be able to draw the rest of your deck. And if you don't have those core pieces already, well, then you're not going to be able to utilize your deck in a way that gets you good value, plus you get to draw, plus you get the consistency of those extra cards. So definitely want to make sure that you're controlling the number of cards in your hand. Sometimes locations can really mess you up, but as long as you're being aware of, okay, if I play Moon Girl, I don't get to draw. Is that worth it? Right? Maybe you want to do something else. So as long as the deck is built right and then you are playing it correctly, you really shouldn't have too much of an issue with that, and you can take advantage of the Devil Dinosaur win condition. Now, you definitely want to decide how you play your final turns out. So it's not, you can't go into those last turns lazy. You can't ignore exactly how you want your power to be. If you usually need one finisher for one lane, depending on, if there's nexus and stuff like that, you might have to change that. But generally, right, Devil Dinosaur, DarkHawk, and Mystique, right, 2 of those you want in your hand, 1 to win each particular lane. So Devil Dinosaur into Mystique, that can give you a lot of power. DarkHawk into Mystique can give you a lot of power, as well as just going DarkHawk and then synergy cards into the final lane. So you maybe like Dino, and then you go Moon Girl last turn to really buff up the Dino if you really need that points in that particular lane. So you just generally have to just always be thinking about, how do I want these last turns to play out? What power do I want here? What power do I want there? You always want to calculate the final power of DarkHawk and Devil Dinosaur, because it's very easy to mindlessly play this and not really pay attention to exactly how much power your DarkHawk is going to have at the end of the game, how much power your Dinosaur is going to have at the end of the game. So you just want to make sure you're calculating those points correctly so that you can predict how much power your opponent's going to have and make sure you overcome those numbers. Because if you're just playing Dino and then you just drop a bunch of cards, you're going to lose that strength in that Dinosaur lane, and that might be something you're not really paying attention for, especially if you're new into DarkHawk, you're new into Devil Dinosaur. Those cards can really rapidly change their power levels very quickly in a match, depending on what you play and how you play it. So you definitely have to be careful, definitely have to be conscious of how much power they're going to have for the final turns, because that's a really big important factor of playing this deck correctly. And then lastly, cards like Cosmos, Shang-Chi, that can be used to deny opponent strategies and Moongirl RockSlide can be used on the final turns as a surprising boost of power. So there's a lot of tech in this deck where if you want to deny a Cosmo, Shang-Chi, those are really used in the final turns if you think that's going to mess up your opponent. And then you have the ability to just boost up a lane that you're not even playing with the Moongirl, with the RockSlide, just giving power to those finishers so that you can maybe surprise your opponent in winning a lane they might not be fully expecting. So here we have some of the powerful plays with this deck. So you can see that it's a very consistent 20 plus power deck list. If you go Devil Sword Mystique, I did base 5 cards in your head just to have something. I didn't want to say, oh, it's three power or more. Like, that's not really going to make anyone excited. But with Devil Dinosaur Mystique, if you have only 5 cards, you can go up to 7 cards, right? So this can be even more power, significantly more power. This can go up to like 31. So 23 is just a nice number that you can really think about. Here we have the RockSlide, the rock engine with the DarkHawks. You put 3 rocks in there with the DarkHawk, you're going to have 20 power base, plus any synergies you have from the locations. It can be even more. And then you have the RockSlide, DarkHawk, Mystique combo, right? Something that you see a lot with this type of deck. You can really get 26 power flexibly into a ton of lanes. So there's a lot of consistency with this deck. There's a lot of power with this deck. You just have to make sure that you're using it correctly. Make sure that you're not messing up with the Mystique combos and things like that. But generally a strong, consistent deck if you can play it out correctly. Now let's talk about some of the flex spots here. Quinjet is not necessarily a flex spot. But it's not that important in this deck because you're really only getting discounts from the Sentinel, which isn't that important, or the Moongirl, which you're not really going to see all the time. And here we do have White Queen, which you can get a discount on, but a lot of decks don't even play the White Queen itself, so Quinjet's not like super necessary. Zabu is definitely more important of a piece to have than the Quinjet, so if you want to play something else, have a different idea in mind, you can definitely do that. And then White Queen is just the cheapest version of card draw. A lot of people use Educatedcollins right now because it's cheaper, it gives you more draw, and you can play it on turn 3 without having to have the Zabu down. So that's definitely something you see a lot more, but White Queen is pretty consistent and very easy to access. Cosmo is also a flex spot. Some people don't like playing Cosmo. Cosmo is pretty popular right now because people are playing a lot of on reveals that are annoying, but if you're not into that meta or you're not playing opponents that do that, you don't have to play Cosmo at all. It's really just a preference for how you're dealing with the meta and what you're fighting against. Now here we have some flex spot options. There isn't too many things to think about. Really, the structure of the deck is pretty solid right now, so there's not a lot of experimentation people are really going to do. But Agent Coulson we talked about already. Maria Hill is another replacement that people do instead for the Quinjet. So, and then there are in the regular deck list we don't have any 6-drops, but you can definitely put a decent number of 6-drops there depending on what you think works best for you. Dr. Doom is probably the most common one, but you do see Chavez, you do see She-Hulk, you do see Leader sometimes that you can just put into the final turns if you really want to have a little bit of a surprise for them. So if you're running Sunspot, I mean She-Hulk, you can always run Sunspot if you want to do that. But it's definitely, you have enough 1-drops that you don't have to flood your deck with a ton of 1s. So Sunspot's really fallen out of favor because you're already playing Korg, and sometimes you're playing Quinjet or Agent 13. So it's really hard to really put that Sunspot in the deck, especially with the nerf that they had. Super Scroll is more of a tech counter. If you're fighting mirrors, Super Scroll just gives you so much power, gives you another win condition. So if you're seeing a lot of DarkHawks, that can be a pretty reliable answer to really contest those lanes. You just gain their power and really mess with what they want to do. Next up, we have Master Mode. Master Mode can be pretty annoying into some matchups, and it buffs the DarkHawk a lot of the times because you're giving them 2 cards that are hard to get rid of. So that could be a nice tech tool if you want to do something fancy, particularly and you have the Master Mode. Agent 13 is more for Dino composition, but it works very well in here if you want to do that. It gives you another 1-drop. It's pretty flexible. There is some downsides with maybe drawing too much or maybe hitting a draw that you don't want, like Agatha. That can happen. So you do have to be careful about it. But overall, it's a generally fine card that isn't too much of a downside. And then Sarah is a nice tech that people have been experimenting with, just putting Sarah in and going for the Sarah control finish. And I've definitely seen it work out. It isn't something that I've tried particularly, but I've definitely seen a lot of people putting Sarah in a lot more decks. So it's definitely something you can see and see if it feels really good for you. Arrow can be just a nice surprise. People aren't expecting Arrow as much anymore since it got nerfed. But it still works well, especially if you can predict exactly what they're going to play. So Arrow can be a nice tech tool if you want to do that. Then we have the Black Widow. This just buffs your DarkHawk, annoys your opponent, something you could easily add. Jeff, you could put in anything, honestly. And you could put it in this deck, so put a Jeff in. Enchantress and Rogue are just general counters. As the meta changes and it becomes more ongoing heavy, the Enchantress gets a big buff and the Rogue is pretty annoying. So these are just tech cards. If you don't want to play Shang-Chi, if you don't want to play Cosmo, you can definitely put Enchantress or Rogue in there and see if that works better for you. Now, core card alternatives. Honestly, this deck is not that flexible in terms of being able to play with a limited number of Series 3, Series 4 cards. I feel like you need Zabu, you need DarkHawk, you need Mystique, you need RockSlide if you're going to play this deck, so that kind of ruins the amount of flexibility you can really change things out. Quinjet's really the only one that is hard to acquire that you don't really need. You could run Agent Coulson, Maria Hill, whatever you want. You don't actually need a Quinjet in this deck, but you do need a ton of other cards. So this is really not the most flexible deck. Definitely an expensive deck in that aspect. So you do have to be aware that, oh, I can't really swap a lot of things because a lot of things are necessary for a DarkHawk engine to work. Now, something I haven't really talked about in many deck breakdowns, but I did want to talk about in DarkHawk is that there are some locations that give you extreme advantage. Just so much power or pressure or tempo can be acquired from having one of these three locations on the board. So Subterranea, once again, this is DarkHawk specific. So if you don't have DarkHawk in your hand, it doesn't really work. But Subterranea, it shuffles 5 rocks in your deck. That's going to give you your DarkHawk plus 10 base. That's so much base power to get for free from a location that can just generally win you a lane that you have no business winning. So definitely Subterranea, if you have your DarkHawk in your hand, is so strong, you can definitely consider taking advantage of that. And then the other two just are when you play a card here, they shuffle 3 rocks into your deck. So anytime you play, your opponent plays a card there, your DarkHawk, your Mystique gains plus 6 power. That can also be very hard, especially when your opponent doesn't know that you're a DarkHawk deck yet. If you've played something like Korg turn 1, well, you've given them enough information, but a lot of times you haven't done anything and they're just like not sure what you're doing. So this can be really come as a surprise how you're taking advantage of it. Also, it can be a bit of a free lane for you, because if they play anything into this lane, you might just win the other 2 lanes for free because you've had your DarkHawks or something on those other 2 lanes, meaning that you can win this lane very easily without investing that much or anything at all. And then they have to either give up that lane for free or they have to really focus on the other 2 lanes, meaning that as long as you over index on one of the other 2 lanes that you've gotten, you win that lane, and then the lane that you're getting for free, it can be a very easy game. So these 3 locations in particular for DarkHawk decks just have such an insane advantage that you want to take advantage of those locations. Make sure you're aware of how beneficial they are for you and use it to your advantage. Now, when should you stop? We've just talked about the location advantage of those 3 locations, as well as there's other locations you can take advantage of, but those 3 in particular. And then also having a good setup. So if you have the Zabu, you have the Quinjet, you have the rocks in your opponent's deck or their hand, that can be very strong setup so that you could win those final turns out. And then just making sure you have a powerful turn 6 swing. So usually that's going to mean Mystique plus some synergy. So let's say you play Devil Dinosaur on 5. Well, if you go Mystique on 6 and then Coulson on 6 as well, right? You get a ton of power into those final turns. So as long as you have that ability to swing very large on the turn 6 swing, usually with Mystique, that can be another reason to snap. Now, what are some of the weaknesses of this build? Obviously, Enchantress and Rogue really shut down everything you want to do. They turn your card into 0 power cards or 3 power cards, or they steal your power, which is crazy good for them. So those can be really, really big counters to what this deck wants to do. If your opponent is playing like something like Serra Control, you have to be really scared of that matchup because they can just deny you instantly. Shang-Chi as well can be really annoying because you can easily go over 9 power with both of your win conditions. So if they're playing it correctly, they can just Shang-Chi. You can do some sneaky things because you can also manipulate your power a little bit. But overall, it's usually bad for you. It's kind of hard to really outplay the Shang-Chi most of the time. And then draw cards messes with DarkHawk, so things like Jubilee will pull a card from their deck, so you're losing that extra power that the DarkHawk will bring you, as well as locations. There's a lot of locations that give you draw in some way, so that can also be a pretty big weakness if you're not playing into that with that knowledge. And then Super Scroll is just like another version of Enchantress Rogue, right? It steals your ongoing, so it's just another way of just dealing with the Dino, dealing with the DarkHawk. So there are a decent amount of weaknesses for this type of deck, but its consistency is pretty strong, and a lot of people aren't really running those counters right now. Obviously, as the meta changes, people run more counters, but for now, you can definitely do some safe plays and not feel too pressured with that. Now, finally, let's talk about some of the example builds that we have. So first build just adds a Dr. Doom here. So it's not really anything too different. You just take out the White Queen. So you can see like a lot of the builds aren't super unique. They just kind of remove 1 or 2 cards. It's not that big of a deal essentially to kind of move this deck. So that's kind of something you want to keep in mind. Like there's a lot, the solid or the structure of this deck is pretty consistent, and you just kind of move around 1 or 2 cards depending on what you think you need. Next up here, we do have the Chavez now. We also don't play the Quinjet in this one, and instead we're running Agent Coulson, and we're also running Super Scroll. So this is just a more counter tech heavy list with the Agent Coulson. Just to deal, this is maybe better into a mirror or something like that, having a Super Scroll, but you have the consistency as well with the Chavez to draw what you need when you need it. Next up, here we're adding the She-Hulk here. This one also has the Green Goblin, maybe to kind of deal with the Galactus matchup or something like that. And you also have the Rogue for maybe mirrors or so. So this is another very tech-heavy deck. And then the She-Hulk just allows you to do something like Moon Girl Pass, double She-Hulk, and a DarkHawk or something if you want to do it like that. So there's definitely a lot of flexibility in a list like this. You do have to be careful because Rogue, right, if you don't have any synergy, doesn't do anything. But same thing with like Shang-Chi, and people still play it. So as long as you're able to get those pieces off when you need them, then it seems like a pretty good list to run. Next up, this is a list with Serra. I was talking about how Serra has been played in a deck like this, and you can see how you play a Serra on 5, you get a lot more flexibility. It's kind of like a replacement for the Zabu if you don't have Zabu. I've definitely seen this type of list with both Serra and Zabu in it, and you just flood on the final turn. But this is a strategy that I have seen people have success with, where they're just using the Serra as another way of having a lot more options in the final turn. So definitely something you can try if it looks interesting to you. If you're very familiar with Serra control lists, then see if you have success with this one. And then finally, we have a leader version. Leader is back in the meta because they got buffed. Now it's able to do some leader things of old and can be pretty annoying in the right scenario. So definitely it can be a nice alternative win condition if you have the setup correct. And if you like leader, well, I'm judging you, but it is something that has worked and will probably continue to work as long as the cards make sense, and the synergies and setups you have are pretty strong. So if you like Leader, you want to play it, you can definitely try a build like this. Maybe you'll catch some people off guard and get a free win for yourself. So definitely, that is the DarkHawk Dino deck list. Some of the strategies, tips, and tricks to really do well for it. Hope you guys enjoy this one, and I'll see if I can get some nice gameplay or something like that in the future. But yeah, take care, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day. I'll see you in the next one.
Educatedcollins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be